Joining me now is Huda Idris, who's founder and CEO at Dot Health, Sadia Muzaffar, co-founder of Tech Girls Canada, and Jonathan Nightingale, founder and CEO of Raw Signal, a consulting firm that offers leadership training to growing organizations. All three of you, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here to talk about this tonight. We'll talk about the bigger issue, obviously, women in tech more broadly, but I'd like to get your reactions to the news headlines of this past week. So why don't we start with you, Sadia? What did you make of the Google memo?
I'm unsurprised and impatient for us to move forward with this conversation. So I'd like to
We're not over this yet.
We're not over this yet. And I'd like to get to a point where we stop being surprised and look to what we can do so this doesn't happen. And it's Google, but also everywhere else. Like, we need to have a bigger conversation so that we put it behind us for good. Which
we will tonight. But I'm wondering about you too, Huda. Sadia, not surprised. How about you?
Yeah, it's been a series of these incidents that keep happening, and almost every time the question comes back to surprise around it. And having lived the life of the woman who works in technology, it's pretty much an everyday occurrence. This one just gets more headlines.
And what about you, Jonathan? What do you think of the incident itself?
Yeah, I think it's fashionable to say it was surprising, but I've worked in a lot of engineering organizations, and they always put a high premium on, oh, we should be able to have an honest conversation about this. Nobody needs to get their feelings involved. You know, I think the memo even had that language. We should get emotion and empathy out of it and just be rational about it. It's exhausting, right? Like, it really ignores a lot of the context that this industry has had, and the fact that for a lot of people, we've had this conversation hundreds of times, right? It's a tired conversation, and we really need to start moving past it.
Okay, well, let's have the conversation one more time and see if we can come at the end of things to solutions to move past it. Huda, tell me a little bit about your experience. I'm wondering if what we've learned about Google's culture has been mirrored in any way in your life. When you were wanting to work in the technology industry, how difficult was it for you to get in?
I went to engineering school, so the culture that I learned in, that I really grew up in, mimicked that of technology. But it was very apparent when I went to the University of Toronto for engineering, and for every, it was an 80-20 split. So you would typically be the only girl in a classroom full of boys. And when I look at it now, where I've founded a tech company, this is the fourth venture I've been a part of, and that continues. I keep going into board meetings where I'm the only female and it's just a room full of men, and I keep looking at other founders who are just predominantly white men. And what they're often looking for, at least in the case of venture capitalists, is mini versions of themselves. And I can tell you that for an older white man, it's very difficult for himself to picture a young him in me.
Okay.
And that I found to be very challenging.
Come back to the financing a little bit later on.
Sure.
When we talk about solutions to some of this, because many people look to that, getting that money as being something that will change things. But I'm wondering about you, Sadia, too. Sadia, in terms of your working elsewhere, whether you felt your progress was stalled, or what was your personal experience as being a woman in tech?
I also want to take this opportunity for us to talk about how it's not just being a woman in tech, right? So somebody like me occupies several different intersections. So I'm a woman, but I'm also a woman of color. I'm an immigrant. So all of these things play into how relatable I am to somebody when they're looking to make a decision to hire me, buy from me, work with me, and partner, all of those things. And while maybe each interaction in and of itself is not big, when you have like 500 of those in a week, it wears you down. And I think it's like a tax that we pay continually, and it makes a difference in our productivity. I don't want to do that. I'm very passionate about the work that I do, about working in technology. I think it has a lot of promise, and my energy should go towards building in tech, not proving over and over again that I belong.
As somebody who worked in the recruiting ends of things, Jonathan, in both now in consultancy, but also in previous parts of your career, did you look to bring women in? What were the challenges that you faced when trying to do so?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that everybody says in tech when they're hiring is, oh, you know, we'd be happy to hire a more diverse team. We want to hire a more diverse team. We're just not getting the candidates, or we don't want to lower the bar, or some other sort of lazy version of it. And I'm sure I was guilty of it too. Like, the truth is to actually engage with some of this stuff and say, well, what's it going to take? How much of our hiring process just assumes, for instance, that you're not a single mom, that if we want to book you for 5 to 6 p.m. for an interview, you're just going to do it, right? And we're okay applying that pressure because we're the employer, right? Do you, as part of your interview process, talk about parental benefits, right? Because if a woman's interviewing who's pregnant, for instance, they may not want to ask that question up front, right? So I think one of the real challenges when you're an employer and you're in a hiring position is to get educated about where are there elements to our process that aren't overtly biased. We're not saying, like, I don't want a woman for this role, but nevertheless are telegraphing a lot of, I want you to look more like me. Right, I want to hire people.
Was saying,
who match.
Bosses generally hire and promote those who resemble them. But even in this very controversial memo, the whole idea of part-time work, really emphasizing the culture of part-time work, maybe making it more conducive to women, was brought forward. In terms of solutions, what are the key things that you see, Huda?
I think we need to get past the this is a pipeline problem excuse. I'm done with it. I know lots of other people are done with it.
Explain pipeline problem.
Typically when, and I do this quite a bit in the community, where I will confront people if they have a very low gender parity within their teams, typically management teams, because I believe a lot of this culture and a lot of these decisions stem from the top down. And every time I've brought this up to an organization, they've typically come back with, but you know how difficult it is. It is not enough females coming out of engineering and STEM programs, and hence we cannot. And I think that's a really easy cop-out. When I was in engineering school, our entrance rate for females was just under 20%. Under Dean Christina Mann now at the University of Toronto, they're seeing numbers of up to 40%. So just looking at that, and that change has been made in the last 4 to 5 years, I think that's quite remarkable, and I would like people to go beyond that. I think what we should focus on is the culture that we're creating in the organizations that we're expecting women to thrive in. Women drop out of technology at a faster pace than any other group of people. And there's a reason for that. We've actively created an environment that is hostile towards them. So I think we need to take a good, hard look at the cultures in the workplaces that we build, that we're not constantly focused on something that is considered more masculine, that all our outings are not focused around pubs, that we are doing more when it comes to actually trying to bring in lots of people and helping them work together, rather than hiring for the person who plays basketball with me, which is how it works often.
And what are your thoughts, Sadia, in terms of solutions here to look beyond and try to change some of those numbers? You know, the number, the 20% figure has been in place for many, many years.
Many years, and it's slipping. We're actually regressing in terms of progress. There's a lot more talk and not enough action, which is worrisome to me. I think we need to get away from thinking that there's a turnkey solution, that you can just add more women or add more people of color and suddenly the balance will shift, because the conditions of their work matter a lot. And we need to look at it through the lens of, are we creating environments where there is an incentive to behave a certain way? Because no behavior can perpetuate if we don't reward it, right? So if we have an organization that is 80% straight white men, clearly there's a reward system there that is making sure that that happens and continues. So we need to take a deeper look at not just hiring, but also who gets promoted, who gets to make decisions about what happens next in terms of the visions, and how are we paying? Pay equity is huge. Are people getting paid for what they're worth, and are they going to stick around because they're being rewarded for their work? So it's a multifaceted conversation, and I would not want to oversimplify it.
You know, and it's key. It's clear that there's not just one key to all of this. Last word to you. I think we could talk much more all night in terms of rectifying the situation. But when you go into a company, when there's a leadership issue before you and it's increase the diversity, what's the most important advice you have?
You know, I think the thing that we say to almost every leader is the modern context is different, right? You need to take ownership for the culture you're building, and you're not going to be able to just hire all the dudes in hoodies, right? And often when we talk to those leaders, they, you know, you take something like this memo, they'd say, oh, well, I would never write that. I don't believe that, right? You take what's happening in the States, they're like, oh, I'm opposed to that. I'll tweet about it, right? But when you ask them, what concrete steps are you taking today? How are you changing your interview process? How are you changing your corporate culture? They come up short. And the reality is, and I think my co-panelists have illustrated it nicely, the systems in place are going to act against you here. If you're trying to build a more diverse and inclusive company, those aren't the habits today. Any day you're not working on making that better, you're slipping.
Thank you very much, all. A pleasure to have you in tonight.